Hey everybody, welcome to Sex on the Spectrum. For the purpose of this presentation, I am going to be using some very specific language. I'm going to use spectrum to indicate the many neurodiverse people. So folks like me who are on the autism spectrum, ADHD, um, BPD, like pretty much all the letter combinations. I like this term better than just saying autism spectrum disorder because it is more inclusive and it really steps away from that ableist view of a disorder and instead notes the atypicality without pathologizing. And before we dive in, I also want to note that, wow. Hi everyone, welcome to Sex on the Spectrum. Before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge the great privilege I have to be here presenting from Treaty 6 territory, which is home to many Indigenous cultures, including First Nations, Cree, Blackfoot, Sioux, and Métis folk as well. I am still unpacking my own colonial upbringing, and I strongly encourage you to do the same and learn more about this amazing land and the diverse cultures of the caretakers of this land. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be using some language, including the term spectrum, which I use to indicate the many diverse folks who are neurodivergent, such as autism, FASD, attention dysregulation, that sort of thing. I prefer the term neurodivergent. I find it to be a lot more inclusive, and it also steers away from that whole pathologizing thing that comes with the whole idea of it being a disorder to have autism or ADHD. And instead, it looks at the atypicality of it. And for the counterpoint, I'm going to be referring to people who aren't neurodivergent as allistic, meaning everybody else and how they behave. So part of my setting a safer space for these kinds of conversations is that I do my best to include a non-heteronormative, non-cis based, non-misogynistic framework when we're talking about sex and gender and sexuality. So some of the language I use to do that might feel different to you, and that's okay. It just takes, practice to hear those kinds of terms. And if you have questions about what anything means, please interrupt me and I will clarify. I'm also coming from a very sex positive perspective, meaning that providing there's consent and we're talking about mature sexual activity, it's normal and healthy in all of its diverse forms, regardless of where that takes somebody. And I also suggest that we just agree that if anybody shares any personal stories, we're not going to use those stories. I find it makes people more comfortable to share and ask their questions and be vulnerable if they know that when you're using what you learned in this presentation today, that you're not going to give away their identity and attach to their stories, right? So to say, hey, today I learned from somebody who's had lived experience, blah, 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 is fine. We don't want to be giving away the story attached to the identity without that person's permission. Is there anything else you folks need to feel safe today? Thank you. All right. This presentation was hosted by Advocating for Sex Positive Education and Consent Culture, otherwise known as ASPEC. ASPEC is a nonprofit that has been around since 2015. We're entirely volunteer run, and I'm one of the original founders of that nonprofit. It has been a heck of a ride. We focus on sex positive education around healthy relationships and ways to reduce gender based violence and things like that. And you can contact us at the email that's up there, admin@aspec.ca, and check out the website as well. Lots of programming on Aspec. So the must include it about me slide. My name's Angel. I use they them pronouns. I consider myself fembi, like feminine non-binary, because nothing I can do about certain shapes of my body without harming myself. So I'm always going to be interpreted or perceived as someone who's feminine. I am queer. I'm the parent of two adults who are neurodivergent and one adult who swears they're not neurodivergent. And maybe they're right, maybe they're not. My partner is autistic and has ADHD, and I myself am neurodivergent. I'm a student right now at Yorkville University, just starting my practicum for the Masters of Counseling program, and that's as of December 2022. So if you're watching this later, I'll probably have my master's. Pretty excited, and I'll be heading into a PhD program after that. I am a certified sex educator. I have been a sex coach for years. I'm a first responder to sexual assault, and I'm the program administrator and healthy relationships educator at Aspec. So let's talk a little bit about neurodiversity so that when I dive into the research on sex and gender as it applies to neurodivergent folk, we have a better idea of what I'm including. So when we talk about folk who are neurodivergent, including people like me with attention deficit and autism, and also including everything on here and things related to it, what we're talking about is a category of individuals who, because of the way their neurology is set up naturally from birth, and is more likely to be correlated with higher degrees of depression, anxiety, isolation, and loneliness than neurotypical peers because of the way society is structured. So, while there's an abundance of relationship on the correlation between autism and depression, for example, until recently, very little research was actually available to look at the sexuality and the relationship skills of young adults and older adults who are neurodivergent. So in this presentation, these are the types of things that we're including on the spectrum, and we're looking at some pretty recent research and summarizing that research on neurodivergence and asexuality. And we're going to take that information. Sorry, I said and asexuality, but I mean including asexuality. Yay, dyslexia. I'm using the wrong words. But we're going to summarize all of that and then include some proposals for how we can move forward with sexual health programs, healthy relationship programs to better support individuals who are neurodivergent that allows for adult relationship satisfaction, social inclusion, connectedness, all the things that we also support for neurotypical individuals. So, research. Like I said, autism, sexuality, these things aren't very well studied, at least in the past, because folks on the spectrum were kind of viewed as if we were just simply not sexual. That's a direct quote from Sullivan and Catrino, that we were viewed as we simply were not sexual. What research was available often focused on exceptions to what is factually accurate for most neurodivergent people, which limited the research to things like sexual deviance, public masturbation, sexual victimization. Hartman et al. Has a really good article diving into those trends. Recent research has begun to also explore sexuality of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and other neurodivergence in a much broader, more inclusive sense. And the findings are as diverse as the spectrum itself. And when you go through my slide notes, you're going to notice that I go back and forth between using the term neurodivergent and autism. And the research reason for this is that there's a lot more research focused on autism than there is on the broader umbrella of neurodivergence. But more recent research also shows that when we're talking about autism, there's a lot of similar and parallel experiences across the board for neurodivergent folks. So I'm just using a broader brush when we're talking. And of course, it is a spectrum. So these findings are going to vary from culture to culture, and they're not going to represent every individual that you meet in their entirety. So that was my big disclaimer. So most adolescents and adults with autism spectrum disorder are sexual. Most of them desire some sort of intimate relationship. What the more recent research also noted is that many of the sexual behaviors of folk on the spectrum are seen negatively, often due to the lack of practical education for people with autism and other neurodivergence in regards to sex, to consent, to pleasure, and whatnot, which inadvertently can support behaviors like public masturbation, compulsive sexual behaviors, and so forth. And it's a really interesting paper to take a boo at. That's Hartman, 2019. So just make sure that you follow up and read the research. It's pretty intense. Now, when we look at the older research and even some of the more contemporary stuff that does look at sexual deviance, for example, and correlates it to neurodivergence, we need to be thinking about their methodology. So when we look at sexual functioning, there's actually three components, three factors that are part of sexual functioning, and those are behavior, selfhood, and socialization. So, people who find meaningful and satisfactory relationships with others typically exhibit high functioning across all three of these factors. So, in research that was investigating the sexual behaviors and attitudes of neurodivergent youth and young adults, the parents and caregivers were the ones that were involved in the collection of data, while studies that were looking at their neurotypical youth required the peers to disclose for themselves. Okay. The individuals, sorry, the neurotypical peers disclose for themselves. And this created a real lack of valid comparisons when studying those two demographics, specifically studies indicating that parents often either under or overestimate their child or young adult's ability, their comprehension, their sexual interest. And that's whether we're talking about neurodivergent or autistic folk. Parents just tend to have their head in the sand about those kinds of things. So just keep in mind as we're going through these things, the three factors, right? We're going to talk about behavior, which has been studied, selfhood, and socialization, because those are the three components of sexual functioning. And if we're interviewing the parents instead of the youth themselves, we're missing those last two parts, right? We're only getting to see what kind of behavior the parents are noticing and their assumptions about it. And of course, those parental assumptions and caregiver assumptions are based on a lot of valid worries and concern. Research does show us that we worry about our young adult sexual behaviors being perceived as deviant. And as a parent to two kids on the spectrum, I can totally tell you this is true. There's a really high correlation in research between autism, FASD, attention deficit, and sexual fixations and compulsive masturbation. So, we're told this and we hear it on the media, and of course we internalize that and we worry, and unfortunately often our youth and our young adults are picking up on that concern and feeling othered there as well. So just push that to the side for a second. We also worry about them being abused or being abusers. We know that up to I mean, the research says up to a quarter, but more recent research where they changed the wording and instead very explicitly described what abuse looks like, instead of asking them if they've ever been sexually abused, the numbers are way higher. But at least a quarter of folks with ASD have experienced sexual abuse, according to Caller in 2000. Parents also, we're worried about our young adult being able to enter into healthy relationships. We know that it's a challenge to pinpoint very specific deficits that create barriers due to that subtleness of interpersonal skills. So remember that socialization and view of self, that selfhood that comes into sexuality. This is really important here to think about how hard it is to specifically name and identify a barrier to building a long-term relationship. We have a hard enough time doing that with neurotypical holistic adults over neurodivergent adults. So we're worried, right? We worry they won't be happy as adults. And our concerns are actually valid. Research does show that even though neurodivergent folk experience equal levels of sexual and romantic relationships as their peers, they often really struggle to find those meaningful connections. Hancock et al. Took a look at this in 2019. There's some really good research there that you can take a look at as well. And although we tend to worry about our youth and our young adults, as parents, we're really prone to underestimating our children's sexual behaviors. Joyal Tal, one of my favorite researchers in sexual behavior, actually from Montreal, in last year, has an amazing paper that looks at parent perceptions compared to the actual reality of the youth experiences. So, parents, including myself, while raising my children, we're often focused on our child's ability to develop those friendship skills to mimic holistic friendship skills. In the absence of this occurring, we make a lot of assumptions about their adult interests or their ability or desire to engage in these romantic or sexual relationships. Also, keep that in mind as we're moving forward. These are normal concerns. They're valid concerns and thoughts based on the information that we've been giving to people and that we've had up until, more recently. So many of our neurodivergent youth and young adults are really socially isolated. So they're not learning from their peers the way holistic youth do. And this, I can't stress this enough. Our current sex ed for is aimed at holistic youth with the assumption that they're also going to have that peer-based education where they're going to learn about the context around the education that's being provided to them and how to shape that for social appropriate interactions, including around dating and sex and flirting in those peer-to-peer settings. There is no other way to get that information out of society without deliberately and mindfully creating those opportunities. So, anyways, even with standard sex ed, they're not learning all of those contexts because they don't have the same access to those peer to peer situations. Yet research shows us that neurodivergent teens and young adults are often presenting with higher rates of sexual behavior than their peers. So I just want to repeat that: higher rates, not lower. So when folks are neurodivergent, we tend to assume, even though we can watch puberty happen, we see it happening. They are going to physically progress in similar fashion to their holistic peers. And even though we see that, we notice that some of their emotional regulation is less developed. And I think that's what causes parents, caregivers, educators just kind of make assumptions that their sexuality, because we view that as something that has a lot to do with our emotional regulation in our society, that we just make the assumption that their sexual development isn't going to happen, even though we can visually see puberty happening. Research shows that um, 10 to 30% of neurodivergent youth will experience an uptick in behavior problems in their teens. And for those with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, it's even higher than those without those extra barriers. And this can mean inappropriate sexual behaviors as the individual is experiencing biologically driven desires without that socialization or understanding of the norms to govern their behavior. So you remember that bit where I said that parents were answering the research questions for most of the studies about sexuality and autism? So you have to check this out. So Hartman et al. In 2019 showed that parents underestimate the sexual activity of their neurodivergent young adults. They had both youth and parents fill out the same survey and answer the same interview questions. And here's some of the largest discrepancies. I mean, there's lots across the graph here, then you're more than welcome to take a look at that as well in the paper. But parents underestimated the age of youth for their first sexual encounter. Youth access to sexual information, the youth or young adults' interest in sex and dating, the youth creativity in finding opportunities to engage in partner and sexual behaviors. They also overestimated, the youth or young adults' ability to navigate consent, to advocate for their own boundaries, and to bring the parent any negative sexual encounter they experience. And like when we look at some of these numbers, right? Already dating is the one that really brought this home for me. Like you can see that like that is almost 60% more of the youth were dating than parents realized, right? Interested in having sex, double, right? Already having sex, a little higher even. So recognizing that these are real things, right? Capitulated to having sex they didn't want, a very high number. And parents are like, oh no, didn't happen, right? So we need to recognize that. Nearly all of the youth in the study reported struggling to stop when a partner wanted them to, difficulty recognizing when someone wasn't interested, and being bullied into sexual interactions they weren't willing to be involved in. Does anyone know what that would look like for neurotypical youth? If we're talking about autistic folks? Because it's actually pretty similar to this, but the parent numbers are a little higher. Like, I would say, like, half the discrepancy. Okay, so let's just look at some statistics and specific sexual behaviors. And when we're talking about these statistics, one of my favorites is that young adult males who are neurodivergent are 300 times more likely to engage with a sex worker for their first sexual experience in comparison with their holistic peers. And 79% of neurodivergent young adults reported having at least one not so great sexual experience, which is pretty on par, a little higher even than what we see in our holistic populations. Um, Three-quarters of them display some sexual behaviors, most masturbate, and masturbation was more common in people born with a penis. Sexual behavior with others more common in people born with a vagina. And that also is pretty on par with holistic populations. If they received no sex education, they were more likely to masturbate in inappropriate spaces. If they had some sort of sex ed, way, way less likely. I'm sorry, there should have been a percentage there. So it drops by almost 60%. Those who had sex ed were more likely to date and have consenting partners, about 60% more likely. And in Stokes and Card, they found that, and that's 2005, so I imagine we'd have even better results now, that most neurodivergent folk desired a relationship, but they struggle to find one that is healthy due to lack of social support in this area. So neurodivergent youth and young adults are more likely to experience sexual assault. They're more likely to engage in higher risk activities, have less information on harm reduction, but almost all of them reported wanting to have some sort of a joy friend. Slightly less reported wanting to have sex with someone, but less than that even wanted a long-term sex partner. So more just like every other teenager out there, right? Just wanting to explore some stuff. 40% of neurodivergent folks with penises reported watching porn compared to 76% of typical or holistic youth. So, research indicates this might be due to how neurodivergent folk define porn. I'd like to see more in depth research on this because every neurodivergent youth I've ever worked with over the age of 9 seems to be immensely fascinated with anime and fan fiction, particularly brony fan fiction, which is incredibly explicit and very queer as well. So, sex ed. Without those social norms and contacts being an actual part of sex education for neurodivergent folk, their desire for intimacy can lead to behaviors in conflict with social norms, which includes public masturbation. That statistic, right? 65% will touch themselves in public, although age for that study isn't mentioned. And it's a really old study. So I'd be very curious to see if anybody has more up-to-date numbers. And in addition, young adults who aren't able to access socially appropriate environments to explore their sexual behavior are more likely than those with appropriate outlets to engage in behaviors that are contrary to social norms. And that's just before 2000 by Romludo and Rubble. Yet, people who are neurodivergent are less likely to actually access comprehensive sex ed, and that is true even as of 2019. Parents were more likely to provide information about puberty, hygiene, and privacy, less likely to provide information about birth control, condoms, relationship skills, sexual health, consent. And that is a very recent study by Andre in 2021. When youth were asked if they felt like they had information about sex, like accurate, comprehensive, if they felt that they understood sex and sexuality, significantly less neurodivergent folk felt confident in their knowledge compared to their peers. Again, Joyan Carpentier. Those designated female at birth were more confident than their neurodivergent this designated masculine at birth peers, which again is pretty comparable to the holistic population. And what this tells us is that it is vital that beyond comprehensive sex ed approach is taken with neurodivergent folk, ensuring that implicit, subtle, and contextual rules for sexual behavior are part of their actual education. Research shows that comprehensive sex ed that is offered in public schools has been less effective with neurodivergent youth and young adults than for their holistic peers. And sex ed for ND folk needs to include context and social norms, not the textbook ideals that are taught, but what is actually happening and accepted in society at the time that they're getting that sex education. So abuse, the SAS report by Harman et al. In 2019 did find that youth with autism specifically reported higher levels of sexuality and higher incidences of sexual victimization than the parents did, which really highlighted that need for comprehensive sex ed designed for neurodivergent youth that focused on building that resilience and what to do when they need support. Carpentier et al. In 2021 found that there was no significant difference between neurotypical or holistic and neurodivergent folk for negative experiences based on gender, but that neurodivergent girls experienced higher rates than neurotypical girls. So when we looked at for neurodivergent people, male and female seem to have the same amount of unwanted sexual advances in contact, and same with holistic populations. Male and female populations reported roughly the same. But when we compared neurodivergent femfolk to holistic femfolk, we found that the neurodivergent femfolk it reported a much higher rate in that study, at least. So romance. Adults on the sex spectrum, adults on the spectrum typically indicate that they do have a desire to engage in romantic and sexual relationships, combined with anxiety due to rejection and their own awareness that they have a lack of awareness as to the how of dating. There's a conundrum for you. It was also noted that people with less symptomology associated with neurodivergence, like as per the DSM-5, experience less anxiety and more positive, intimate experience. So this means the folks that don't present with as many barriers had less challenges, which is good. That's reassuring because it tells us where we need to focus our education. The average of first sexual experience, however, was 16.9 years of age, which is comparable to your average holistic age of 15.7. Anxiety was mentioned as a very common barrier for folks forming an intimate relationship if they were neurodivergent. Many folks who were neurodivergent talked a lot about feeling anxious that their actions would be perceived as wrong. There was research that answered two questions about neurodivergent folks by Magavero and Sue in 2020. Do neurodivergent adults have less know-how about romance and intimacy? And do they engage in less appropriate behaviors like stalking, persistent courting than their holistic peers? And their research was incredibly interesting. One of the some of the interesting answers are one male described his reaction when caught engaging in sexual behaviors on school grounds with a high school classmate in Sexuality Disability 2020. I've got the whole, so you can find it. He said, I lacked the emotional maturity at the time and didn't realize the gravity of the situation until the police were involved. The incident knocked me confidence and put me out of romantic relationships for 10 years until my mid 20s when I began dating again. Another male said that he was used by another person when convenient, couldn't handle the confusion of that on again, off again, and got really angry and aggressive. This participant reported that he was arrested and ordered to perform community service. So that research there concluded that neurodivergent folk and relationships with a plea for development of the dating and adult relationship skills to be available. And they caution against using that assumed idea that the standard sex ed will provide neurodivergent folk with the information they need, because those programs are not providing the context for practical dating skills or recognizing boundaries, that kind of thing. Hancock et al. In 2019. This is one of the first large sample size studies of its kind, and it compared your holistic and your neurodivergent folks across the domains of sexual behavior, relationship satisfaction, and barriers to relationship satisfaction, and is bar none my favorite study on this topic to date. Peer social engagement, they found, supplied resilience against relationship anxiety, and it provided insight as to those contextual norms, like what is normal for dating. And interestingly, they also found that a lack of peer social engagement was a risk factor for poor employment, poor post secondary education opportunities, and so forth. Okay. Their study indicated that a lot of neurodivergent people are struggling to maintain relationships, a barrier that was correlated to their peer to peer interaction levels. This study indicated that there is a need for informal sex education from peers to coincide with the more formal school and parent taught sex ed. And then opportunities to practice these skills is vital and often not prominent in the lives of folks who are neurodivergent. And this is really problematic for our neurodivergent youth and young adults who often don't have access to these kinds of social interactions. And when it came to getting someone's attention in the hopes of dating, holistic people report that they teased and bullied people for attention. Do you know what neurodivergent people did? Giving them something nice or having the same interests. So anybody who's familiar with social still skills training should have like little tingly spider sense going on. Like, if that's not the social mores, then why are we still teaching that? Right? Common interest. It's just we're not in the 50s anymore, right? And this seems to me to be like a huge part of how social skills programming really fails neurodivergent people, by the way. Check out my Empower website, my Indie Empower website, because I rebuilt the social skills training to be more empowering and less denigrating to folks on the spectrum. Neurodivergent folk are also less likely than their peers to have sex just because it feels good or just for fun than their holistic peers, 50% compared to 80%. Neurodivergent designated female at birth folk indicated that they would tell someone something about themselves that they believed that person would like in order to have casual sex with them, while holistic counterparts just tease and flirt. Neurodivergent designated female at birth folk also reported a really significantly higher rate at having boyfriends or girlfriends or joyfriends than their holistic peers. And here's where it gets really interesting, at least to my queer self. Um, Spectrum and sexual identities, right? So individuals with neurodivergence are often overrepresented in sexual minorities. 42 to 69% are same-sex attracted, compared to 8% in the general population. They also are more likely to identify as asexual. That's 36%, according to Blush et al. And neurodivergent folk did indicate that they were less attracted to others in a sexual way when compared to their holistic peers, according to Joyal in 2021. So, I also had to add this in here that the folks that were reporting that they were asexual also reported more satisfying relationships. And I'd love to see a study checking this out because it seemed to me that that probably had a lot more to do with being able to set boundaries. Um, just my thoughts there. So the asexual breakdown, 36% of neurodivergent designated female at birth folk fell into the asexual spectrum as follows. 59 clearly identified as ace. 9 were questioning, 7 were gray sexual, they rarely feel attraction. 7 were demi, needing that emotional connection, and 6 were otherwise asexual. Yep. Sorry, I just lost my place that I don't know what slide we're on. The designated female at birth folk who identified as asexual were younger, with a mean age of 22, than their counterparts in the holistic community. They were more likely to be non-binary. Huge surprise. Asexual identifying folk were also more likely to have had more satisfying sexual relationships. Although most chose to be single, explore friends with benefits that understand both their gender and their sexual orientation. And that was found in a few different studies. Awesome. Non-competitive, perhaps? More tantric, less penile-centric, not afraid of being alone. Uh, we have questions. We need answers. Do some research. Share the information. So we do know that folk who are neurodivergent are less rigid about their sexuality and their gender than holistic folks are. The research has demonstrated this. And anyone working with neurodivergent youth have probably also noted this. They are more likely to have same-sex relationships. They're more likely to have non-exclusive sexual interests or be interested in alternative sexual activities. Joyal and et al. In 2021. Neurodivergent folk also represent a significantly higher percentage of queer identities across the board compared to allistics. Allistics report being cisgender at a rate of 95%. Neurodivergent folk are reporting at a rate of 73%. And that's already a year old, so I'd be really curious to see what happens next. And I just want to touch on what Joyal said about neurodivergent folk being more interested in alternative sexualities. So I am someone who's been active in various kink communities as well as other alternative communities, and I can confirm that the community includes many, 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 many neurodivergent folks, similar to like a Minecraft club. And I have so many theories about this. Rules, right? There are so many rules that take the fear out of how to do the things. When you're in a kink community, for example, there's a very clear framework, right? First, you talk about what you do want, what you don't want, and what you'd be willing to explore but isn't really important to you. And you look for that Venn diagram to see what matches and what doesn't match. So, pretty easy to follow that. Even rules on when to check in, how to check in, what language to use, and what that language means. Very concise rules. So, that has to be, in my opinion, part of it. And I can't help wonder too if when we take the fear of those dating and sexual interactions out, if that creates a larger vulnerability. Because the good kind of vulnerability, not the bad kind, like where you can actually connect with people and feel empowered in those relationships, even as you're navigating really intimate situations. Because outside of these alternative communities, neurodivergent folk are always being expected to understand the rules, and they in turn expect allistic folks to follow those rules that they're told exist, but people don't always do that. And so it can be very confusing. And then on top of that, endorphins, right? Sensory stuff, aftercare. Like this is like heaven for folk with sensory needs or with dopamine deficiencies, which we know is strongly present in the neurodivergent communities. So just my thoughts. So Oyen et al. In 2018 noted that as these topics become more prevalent in the general population and online in general, that sexual attitudes in society have changed. And this may have been what supported that increase of studies around sexuality and neurodivergent folk. And that is in line with other accepted theories of social change. And we certainly know that our neurodivergent folk excel at finding information on the internet. So it could be that because they spend more time on the internet getting their information from the internet instead of from their peers who may be comfortable with whatever status quo is going on, that is why that we're seeing them branch off into more non-traditional types of sexualities and gender. All right. So finally, in light of this growing body of research that indicates a need for not only more comprehensive sex education for neurodivergent youth, and I would argue adults as well, we also need to foster appropriate peer-to-peer spaces in order to facilitate opportunities for flirting, for dating, for relationship building. And I know parents don't want to hear this, but they also need to have opportunities to explore sex in a safe space. That we need that sex positive lens to ensure that we're including the incredible diversity that's found in gender and sexuality and relationship styles as is already being represented by our neurodivergent folks. Some other possible solutions and potential thoughts that we could follow up on rather than just peers based system. Peers is a formal name of a social skills system for teaching social skills for neurodivergent youth that really focuses on this is how normal people behave, so this is how you should behave. um, is is that rather than doing that, um, and focusing on ASD social skills, vernacular, and rules, like the even the language around it is so pathologizing that maybe we need to assume that our neurodivergent folk don't need to only date other neurodivergent folk. Like that love on the spectrum, I think that that part really bothered me. And therefore, they need the common socially accepted vernacular around dating and the mores around dating in society. And maybe we want to take a closer, more honest look at what flirting and dating in the actual world looks like and start including that in our sex ed instead of pretending that these things aren't happening. Some of the things I particularly have issues with in the way that we teach social skills to our neurodivergent youth is hammering them down about this common interest thing, because we also know that if you have too many common interests, there's not room for growth in that relationship. You're not going to help each other grow and get boring really quickly, right? They'll parallel play forever. um, and how about the rules around teasing and what the social needs are that are being met by teasing? And talking about how the consent bar is actually pretty low in reality. Ideally, we'd like to see it higher. We don't want the gender based violence that we are seeing. But the truth is, the consent bar in society, it's on the ground. And talking about those gender expectations in a way that's reflective of what we actually have in society, not the ideal we want them to think of, but the reality of the situations that we have around gender and sexuality and diversity and all of that. And folks, if you are curious, I have been running a very successful empowerment series with youth and young adults on the spectrum. And instead of teaching them to be moralistic, like I teach them to advocate for themselves, to work on recognizing their own strengths and the areas that they have for resilience building in their teams that they have in their special interests and how that can foster more social competence. Um, and to recognize the beauty in their individuality and prepare them for life situations by exploring the context in friendship and dating and employment rules and all of that kind of thing, and how these things are so similar that when we learn how to behave in one social arena, it easily can be extrapolated to the next if we remember what the framework is that we've learned. So there are a ton of references. I'm going to have to build another reference page because there's more research out that I'm going to be adding to this as I go along. If you come across research, please fire me a message. I'd love to stay abreast of this. This has been one of the most rewarding research projects I've ever engaged in. Um, yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have now.